Alright, welcome back, guys. This is part 2. Our glue has set up for our headstock, I guess you would call it, on our mash paddle, and I've pounded back in. No glue yet on these joints, but I've put our bow tied in braces back in place. And now what I'm going to do, take the two arms. Okay, for these arms that'll get dovetailed into the bracing, I'm just going to kind of eyeball where I want these to go, keeping in mind that I can't go more than 14 inches of a overall dimension for these, and I think I'll have plenty to work with here. So I'm just going to go through, and I want a slight splay on these arms just for aesthetic purposes, and I'm just going to put a mark. I have no idea what angle I'm going for here, but I just know that that looks pretty good to my eye. And then once I have that figured out, I'm going to take my protractor, figure out the angle that I just marked, and lock that in place. And just for your reference, that's 81 degrees. And I'll just figure out how far that is off of the handle piece here, and it's right at 4 inches. So then I'll go in and then just mark it on this top brace over here, 4 inches. Reset my protractor. So that I can transfer those dimensions on the other side. Alright, so that ended up being an 82-degree angle, which looks pretty good, like I said, to me. So I got my mark set in place all the way around here, and I'm going to cut those off right on the marks. And after we get those cut out with a saw, we can just go ahead and start cutting the dovetails on our bracing. Once that's cut out, we'll transfer that onto our two arms that go down the side. So now we have our angles marked on our pieces of bracing here. So now I'm just going to go at this with a fine-tooth saw, just slightly past the line here on the waist side, and just doing the best I can to keep my saw square. I'm going to make those cuts on all 3 pieces, total of 6 cuts here. Alright, now that the side pieces are put back in place over top the bracing here, I'm just going to nudge them up against the edge of the bracing where we made our cuts. I'm just going to go over the edge of these with my marking knife, and this will establish the shoulder for our dovetails. Now that we have our dimensions marked out for those those dovetails, I'm going to take these back out of the handle stock. Now that first initial line that we made with our with our arms in place, I'm going to use it to transfer around my my braces on each side and try to get an even gauge line. if you have any waste left on these saw cuts, you want to take it off so it doesn't interfere with your marking gauge. Now with my dividers, I'm going to try to find center of my gauge line here so that I can start my dovetail. And I'm just going to eyeball where I think center is to start out with. And I'm going to check it from both sides. I'm going to strike a line and adjust it just a little bit each time, striking the line each time until my lines match up, and then I know that I'm on center. So now I'm going to put a mark in the center, and then I'm going to go from that line down to the corner here and use my marking knife to make that line. And with that line made, we'll mark out the waist. And that's what we'll cut out. With my benchtop vise put in place here, I'm going to make the line that I'm going to cut as square up and down as possible so that I can naturally cut down through nice and square. It's going to be kind of difficult to start my saw in this corner for this cut. To help get my saw started, I'm just going to notch out this corner right here the best I can so that my saw doesn't slide down the side of the board as I'm trying to cut. And just nice, easy strokes to start it. And I dissected that line on the way down through. On the shoulder, where it'll butt up against the arms, I'm going to cut on the waist side and give myself some room to chisel so that I get a tight shoulder. Every so often when you're cutting this, especially this walnut, you do need to strop your edge tools. I like to strop mine quite often to keep that edge, the cut that I like to see. This strop that I'm using is one that I made, and you can make one pretty easy with a piece of 1/2 inch plywood and some 3 inch by 12 inch leather. Just take some hide glue and attach it to the plywood. You want the rough side facing up, and then you can get some of the polishing compound and just rub it on the leather, and it really does a nice job of tuning up your edge tools in between actually walking over to the sharpening bench every time. So I'm just cleaning up these saw marks. And while I'm chiseling, a quick word about chiseling is you can see how I have my pointer finger rested up against the workpiece. And with that pointer finger, I like to rest the chisel right on top of it and then lay my thumb on top. That pointer finger will keep me from losing the angle that I want, and then my thumb acts as a brake down through the workpiece. And I don't have to be too picky about these because we're going to transfer the dimension of each one of these individual half dovetail right onto the arm piece. We're going to cut the half laps for these dovetails. Now we need to figure out which side of this and how much we need to cut out. So I'm just going to take my marking gauge and put it down inside, because we mark these bow ties for a half lap, which is halfway through this piece here. So I'm going to use it as a reference because I know it's square and it's halfway through. So I'm just going to push my marking gauge up into that and set it, and then I'm just going to use it to set my marks on these dovetails. And then what I want to do is I want to mark and cut out the opposite side of where the bow ties are, so that my dovetails show up on the back of the arms. So we'll have the bow ties on the front and the half lap dovetails on the back side of the piece. So we're going to cut this section out. I'm going to mark it as the waist. With the workpiece secured in my vise, I'm going to stay well off of that, well, maybe a 1/16 of an inch off of that waistline. That way I can use the router plane to make that mating surface nice and square. Everything seems to fit quite well, so I'm going to pop these braces back out, and we're going to go at this the dovetails with the router plane to get them to the depth that we desire, which I had set with the marking gauge earlier. Get this out of the way. Alright, now I have the workpiece clamped up right here, and I'm going to put a bench dog right here and then use my hold fast to keep it in place, and then I'm going to use another part of the bracing to keep my router plane level as I work through the depth on this. So I'm just going to set my router plane to make my first cut. With our dovetails finally worked out and we have them flattened now, nice and square, we can go ahead and hit these with the marking knife. We're just going to trace around. You want to make sure that you have your arms nice and tight up against those shoulders. And I have mine clamped down with hold fast here. When it comes to marking out joinery, you really can't beat a double bevel knife, because it's got the bevel on both sides, and you can just turn it and flip it as you work around your joints, because sometimes you need to cut from the left and sometimes you need to cut from the right, and if you only have a one-sided bevel, a lot of times it's really hard to do that. So we got our dovetails marked out when we had it laid out on the with the handle stock. So now I'm just going to go through each one of these and establish the shoulders of these cuts. I'm just going to strike a line about 2/3 to a half of the way down the board here with my square. Now I'm going to use my marking gauge to set the depth that we need to go for these dovetails to be let into these arms here. So I'm going to find my thinnest tail. Ideally they should all be the same, but I made a few mistakes on this, so obviously I got a thin one here and I'm going to go with it. And I'm not going to quite measure to it, but I'm going to measure so that it sits proud of the arms, so that I can plane those down flush. We got all of our dovetails marked out now, so we can go ahead and proceed with the cutting. And I'm going to stay well beyond that mark that we made, because we'll chisel up to that later on. As you've probably noticed, I'm a big fan of chiseling up to your final dimension. I know a lot of people, they just go ahead and cut right up to the line. I guess that's fine, but in my experience I found that that really makes for sloppy joints most of the time. So I like to make sure that I have and that'll just make it easier for the chiseling here in a little bit. With all of our cuts made, we'll go ahead and take care of these cutouts with a chisel, and just taking small bites at a time, just kind of work that back with your chisel, being sure not to take too much at a time. With all of our cuts made, we'll go ahead and take care of these cutouts with a chisel, and just taking small bites at a time, just kind of work that back with your chisel, being sure not to take too much at a time. When you're chiseling, you want to orient your chisel to cut up. If you just cut it flush or up a little bit with the bevel, digging into the wood, it'll dig past your depth line for sure. So you want to try to chisel upwards, and once you get to the bottom, you can flush that up by paring later or with your router plane. But you never want to chisel down, because your chisel won't float very well. It'll dig right in. Gonna work these out using my bench hooks to secure it. Now I'm going to pair this with a chisel because almost for sure I'm not going to be able to get at this with my router plane. So I'm just going to go at it from both sides here, keeping my fingers out of the way. There's chisels passing through there. Making small cuts, making that bottom as square as possible so that we get a nice tight joint. And you can almost eyeball that that bottom if you put your eyesight right parallel with it. You can pretty well tell where the high spots are, and you can just knock those down. And get that bottom nice and square with those shoulders. Now we'll go ahead and do a test fit, and there's a good chance it's not going to work because we left those shoulders left, but we'll give it a shot here and see where we're at to start with. So yeah, for sure we got quite a ways to go on those shoulders before they're where they need to be. So I'll get my widest chisel and just start taking these off on one side at a time. Try to fit that again, and we're not quite there, so we'll go ahead and take off that other shoulder as well. I left both shoulders. I suppose when you start out you could probably just go ahead and knock down that one shoulder since we did mark the dovetails right up to them. But I always like to double check my work like this way. You know, I'll leave just a little bit of shoulder, chisel up to it later, and that gives me some lenience. So there you have it. Got a nice tight joint with enough room to plane off later. So we'll go ahead and cut the rest of these out and get it all put together. We got everything chiseled out now, so let's go for a successful test fit here. Just gonna put my bow ties in place. Using a dead blow hammer, I'm gonna lightly tap them into their final positions. Okay, and those fit good. Okay, looks like everything fits good. We've got some excess to cut off here. We have some planing to do, and we'll plane all the way down to our arms here, and then we'll check thickness across both of these until they're the same. So there it is. The joinery works fine, so we'll get it put up in glue and start working on that headstock piece. On a scrap piece of wood, I'm going to put some glue on here. That way I can just brush this on. And you want to coat both surfaces. When you're working joinery like this, you really want to go with a glue that has a pretty decent open working time, because you don't want to get caught in the middle of dealing with tacky glue, which you run into with hide glue a lot of times. So if you're using hide glue, well, you don't want to use hide glue for this because you need a waterproof glue. But most of my joinery for furniture, I'll use hide glue, and I'll just add extra water to it so there's a little more water and it just has a little bit longer open working time. You can really, truly, I know that if you're a woodworker, you probably heard this a lot, but you really can't have too many clamps. You just can't, because you always run into situations where you need more, I think. So I'm just trying to clamp in the middle of each one of these joints and draw them in as tight as I can on that glue. So all those joints look pretty good. They're seated nice and square on the bottoms of those arms. Make sure they're nice and tight.